Hey, Anna from NHCSR here. I have been making these little videos about easy crops for the beginner and what could go wrong so that anybody who is trying to do something that's a little bit more accessible knows what they're getting themselves into. This video is not that. A home orchard is not for the faint of heart. Growing apples or peaches in your home garden is a little deceptive because it seems like, well, they're all over the place. What could be so hard? But it is tricky. You might even be better served by saving the grief and maybe going down the street and spending that money on the apples that are being grown by the experts at your local orchard. I think when push comes to shove, you might find out that if you were given all the resources, expertise, all the stuff and the decades of experience that they did, they probably are making the same choices that you would. And I keep thinking about that children's book. Do you remember? There's a monster at the end of this book. It's Grover Monster, and he has been told that there is a monster at the end of this book. And each successive page, he is saying, whatever you do, do not keep turning this page. There is a monster at the end of this book. Don't do it. And granted, at the end of the book, you find out it is Grover Monster at the end of the book, which is a lovely thing to find out. So maybe this is like that. At the end of this, there's delicious tree fruit. So if you must, here is a summary of all the things that could go wrong with some suggestions about how to approach those challenges. This is all the stuff you should be thinking about before you decide to plant your orchard. I've broken this video down into pre-planting considerations, planting and the first years of vegetative growth, years of fruiting, fireblight and pruning maintenance, leading causes of death, and some alternative approaches to pest management. Also, and you are in luck because I have called in the big guns and I recorded an interview with somebody with years and years of experience helping folks grow tree fruit commercially in the multitudinous ways that you will see people grow tree fruit in New Hampshire.
I'm Jeremy Delisle. I am a field specialist with UNH Cooperative Extension. On our production agriculture team, I work mainly with fruit producers in New Hampshire and surrounding states. One important thing to know is that there are really good resources out there and available as far as learning about orcharding in general, and what are some of the key horticultural aspects to doing that. What are the challenges you're going to be faced with, namely pests and disease that are common in New Hampshire. Everything likes fruit, right, including us, but so do a bunch of insects and animals, and so we have to think about that as we're going into the planning stages of hopefully being successful with a home orchard. I'll recommend that folks look at some of the land-grant university fact sheets, any of the land grants, UNH, UMass, UMaine, UVM. Searching by topic, if you're looking for varieties of trees to grow, or you're just looking about how to prune or just general cultivation of those trees, you can start there, and that'll give you some good fundamental information. And then, a good follow-up, and what we often get is a phone call or an email after folks have looked at those and they still have questions, and they can reach out to, their local extension agent for clarification on those things. One of the other things I would recommend right off the bat, if you're going to put in a new orchard, or even if you have an existing one, is go ahead and get your soil tested, as soon as possible. If you've met an extension person, you've probably heard them say that. But it is really one of those key things that we have to know what's going on in the soil, and just get that really dialed in so that we know that nutrition for the plant, as far as what's there and available in the soil, is not a limiting factor. We kind of just rule that out, and we make sure that we address it. And easy enough to do. And again, your extension folks can help you interpret those results if you need help with that at all.
What's the number one thing that comes back, especially in your neck of the woods, that, the misunderstanding, or what do people need to do to amend their soil?
So oftentimes it's pH. And so that's just a measure of basically the acidity of the soil, how acidic or how basic that soil is. Usually for, say, apples, we would like that to be just slightly acidic to almost neutral, depending on the variety. Low 6s, 6.5, somewhere in that range is kind of what we're shooting for most of our tree fruit. Then there's some key nutrients that are really important. Nitrogen in proper proportions. Potassium is really important for fruit to size up, and then calcium is also really important. We often get that from applications of lime, but that's really good for just like fruit quality, firmness, just producing a good sound fruit.
Otherwise, it would take you a couple of years to figure out that your soil wasn't right. You can know that before you start.
Yeah, yeah, and then I would say the other thing that goes along with that, if we're talking about soils, making sure the nutrition is there. The other key factor to make sure that that nutrition can go from the soil up into the plant is going to be soil moisture, water, to be able to get those nutrients into solution so that the plant can take it up. We've experienced some droughts in New Hampshire. We had one, kind of the tail end of last season, and I think we're kind of still in that at this point. But the plants can only extract so much of that until it gets into solution. So that's important. And that might mean at home we have an irrigation system that we've installed, or we keep it really basic and we just go out there with a hose or a bucket every so often. The only thing I would say with that, with trees, is less frequent deep watering is the way to go. We don't necessarily need to go out there every day and, water for 10 or 15 minutes. We really want deep watering so that it goes farther down the soil profile and those roots have to really explore and expand and go deeper to reach those water supplies, and they'll just become more resilient over time if you continue to practice that.
Yeah, like good horticultural practices.
The other part is it comes down to what are you dealing with in the orchard. I mean, if a home orchardist were to go through and choose resistant varieties as kind of like the foundation of their pest and disease management plan in the orchard, that's already given them a big leg up in having success. If we choose scab resistant varieties, for example, where scab just does not thrive on them, and it's not going to be the issue that it would in some that are super susceptible, then that right off the bat reduces our need to spray fungicides for that particular disease significantly. Choosing that variety and then doing great sanitation underneath the plant, in the fall, maybe scab just isn't really a problem for us. And that's a reality that, we can realize in the home orchard. But you have to think about that, before you plant the orchard. We've already talked about setting the tree up for success as far as, what's happening in the soil, having the nutrients we need there, having adequate soil, managing weeds. And so that could be through something like mulching, and that's going to retain soil moisture, add organic matter, be this kind of trickle fertigation as that organic matter breaks down. That's going to always be there and available for that plant. Doing those things, we've created a healthy plant that is just naturally more resistant. Apples we can grow anywhere. Peaches, Concord, maybe a little bit north. Beyond that, it's kind of year to year as far as whether or not we would expect those flower buds to survive based on the low temperatures that we often get.
They have their good years and their bad years. I mean, how often are you seeing peaches have a bad year because of the extreme cold? And how often is it because they maybe got started too early and get zapped with an early frost? Which one is the more common thing nowadays?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think our kind of general thinking with peaches is that growers kind of anticipate maybe once every 3 years experiencing some damage to the crop from cold temperatures, and that could be from just minimum winter temperatures that are experienced during dormancy even. And so say December through February, with peaches, we normally start to see the very beginning of damage occur at around -4 Fahrenheit. And then there's kind of this curve downward that as we get colder, we would see a higher and higher percentage of fruit buds damaged. We would expect to see that. But that does vary by variety. And so some are hardier than others. And so it really depends. But once we get to say -20, almost no peach buds, flower buds are going to survive that. And so if you're in an area that regularly sees that, um, you may or may not want to grow peaches. They may not be a great bet for you. We do have some. Reliance is one of those varieties that was developed at the University of New Hampshire. It's developed to be a cold hardy variety, and it's aptly named. It's pretty reliable and produce some pretty good quality fruit. There's a really fun article called Just Peachy that we have online that kind of summarizes the cold hardiness trial that we did at Apple Hill Farm in Concord. In that list varieties, some that are cold hardy, more so than others, and then some that are decent as far as hardiness but have exceptional flavor that you might want to roll the dice on and give a shot anyway. Some years you'll probably get them, other years you may not. And the other consideration there, I think, for home orchardists really has to do with rootstock, especially for apples, mainly for size control. And so you have these dwarfing rootstocks where if you only have a little bit of space but you want to grow several varieties, you could plant them as close as like 3 feet apart, 4 feet apart, and really kind of pack them in. And they produce fruit early. So if you're not a super patient home gardener, like, you could have fruit in maybe 2 years from planting your first fruits. Something like peaches, those are going to need a little bit more space. But typically, rootstocks that we would see here are things like Lovell or Bailey, and those tend to do well in our area. With apples, you have many. And so it's either, do you want to fit a bunch in a small space or somewhere in between, or do you want to plant that tree that like your great grandchildren are going to be able to go pick apples off of that's going to live 100 years? And that would be a standard or a seedling rootstock.
Okay, have you heard enough? Are you ready to plant? Definitely reach out to your local extension for recommendations on variety selection, particularly if you live in an area which you think might not be cold enough during the winter for chilling requirements for apple, or if you think you are in an area where it's too cold for peach. So those are the biggest considerations for variety selection. I have included a link from Penn State with some resistant apple varieties, so that's certainly an option. But if you decide that scab is not a big issue for you, this shouldn't be the driving factor. You should pick varieties based on the varieties that you like the best taste-wise, especially if you are planning on taking a very robust approach to IPM for some of these fungal diseases. They are very manageable. You should also think about picking out more than one variety for a couple of different reasons. Having multiple varieties with different maturation times means that you'll have fruit over a longer period of time, some early ones, some late ones. They might tell you how well they're doing in your backyard. Some might do better than others, some might fail, and some might do really well. Also, if you are confident that you have wild apples or crab apples in your neighborhood, this might not be an issue. Having more than one variety will ensure that you have plenty of pollen to cross-pollinate and make sure you get good pollination in your fruit. All right. You've picked out your trees, you've done your soil testing, you've made your amendments, you've decided what irrigation approach you're going to take. My favorite is hose, but if you don't have enough hose, bucket will work. If you're tech savvy or forgetful, getting an irrigation system with a timer may be worth the investment. Trees can come to you as bare root or in a soil ball. Both are fine. The best rule of thumb for any tree is to avoid extreme heat or extreme cold. The bare root tree might be a little bit younger, a little bit more sensitive to cold soils, but this is the most economic way to ship really good stock around the country without transporting soil. Transporting soil around the country is no good for transporting soil-borne pathogens, so we avoid it. When to plant? The recommendation is to plant during dormancy, and that can be in the fall or in the spring. You can plant in the late summer or fall, but you do have to take precautions to protect your trees from mammals over the winter, especially these young guys. Skip down to the leading causes of death if you want to know more about that. You can also plant in the early spring, which could be as early as March, depending on where you are, as long as the ground is not frozen. All right, so your tree is in the ground. It has everything it needs, and for the first year, maybe 2 years, You are just letting that tree be a tree. It is setting its roots, it's growing tree. You're going to do a few deep watering sessions here and there. That's going to depend on what kind of soil you have, and you're following the soil amendment plan that you got after your soil test. So in the first year, that tree is just being a tree. No flowers, no fruit, no hanky-panky. We do this for a couple different reasons. This is partly to make sure that all of the energy that that tree is generating is going into making more tree. Additionally, it is to eliminate one of the primary roots for a disease called Fireblight.
That's a good question too, and one that probably a lot of home growers don't think about. But one of the most important things is managing flower blossoms. With Fireblight, that's a bacterial disease, and that's how it gets into the plant most of the time initially, is through the blossoms. And that bacteria is out there oftentimes in everyone's neighborhood, or in many neighborhoods. It's being moved around in a variety of ways. It might be rain splash, it might be insects, but it's moving around and finding its way onto the flower parts. And then when we get rainfall or even really heavy dews during bloom, then that bacteria can be washed down into the flower and find its way into the vascular system of the tree. And so it's important to know and understand that, because knowing that, we can think about ways, all right, how do we prevent that from happening? For young trees, what you can do is you can go in and pay attention to the phenology of that plant. And so the development of the buds and how they're developing through the course of the early season. And we'll go from dormant to bud swell to what we call tight cluster, where these buds start to kind of open up, and you can see kind of the flower buds before they fully start to kind of unfurl. They're still covered in the bracts of the flower, and then they'll start to separate. That would be a great time with young trees to go in and remove those flower blossoms, or those clusters. You can just do that by hand. You can do it with a nice sharp pair of scissors or a sharp pair of pruning shears. One of the reasons doing it early is important is, one, those flowers aren't open yet, and so we need open flowers for that infection to happen. The other thing is that typically that early, temperatures are still pretty cool. And with Fireblight, temperature is an important factor in how much of the bacteria there is available and active. And so doing it early, getting all those off. And the other part of that is that by removing those flower blossoms, we are telling the tree, we don't want you to focus on producing fruit or reproduction. We want you to focus on putting on new growth and vegetation, and establishing that structure of the tree, which is so important for a young tree, because we want it to just grow roots, grow its trunk and limbs, and just get the structure in place that can then support fruit and the weight of fruit long term.
Okay, you have reached the end of year 1, and we're in the dormant period. Maybe the leaves of the trees have started falling off. The best time to assess Fireblight severity is during the dormant period, or right at the end of the summer. You would have pretty severe Fireblight pressure in your neighborhood if you were starting to see Fireblight strikes in your first couple of years, especially if you are removing those blooms. This bacterium can get into the plant other ways, but the main route of infection is through the blossoms. The dormant period is also the best time to prune, and it is important to get some solid architecture going on even in the initial years. So please pay attention to the recommendations from your local extension office. It's also a good idea to start practicing good sanitation early on. By this, I mean keeping a weed-free zone around the trees. There's a couple different ways to achieve this. You can use herbicides, you can use tarping, you can use cultivation, physical removal. You can mulch, but make sure to keep the mulch away from the tree trunk, making things not as nice for the voles. Something that you should do early, just to get used to this, make it part of your practice, is picking up those apple leaves and bringing them somewhere else, composting or chopping them up really finely so that they degrade over that winter time. The apple leaves is where the fungi that cause apple scab and some of the other fungal diseases will live. So if that's broken down, it slows the buildup of inoculum over time. So we do talk about how apple scab, it's a cosmetic injury that happens to the fruit, but if you have very severe disease inoculum buildup, it can lead to health problems in the tree, but that would be many years down the road. Nonetheless, it is a good idea to start early and often when it comes to cultural practices like this.
What I would really love to see more people doing is just some really basic monitoring at home of insects. I talk about the big five with apples, and that includes pests and disease. But if we're talking insects, we're talking about plum curculio, which is super early in the season, and then we're going to get into codling moth as our other big kind of midsummer insect that we want to monitor for. And then late in the season, apple maggot fly would be the other thing that we would want to monitor for. And there are really simple, relatively inexpensive traps and lures that folks could get in just small kits that are perfect for home use. And just monitor, because you may or may not have a problem with those insects. And if you could rule out just one of those three insects, then you've opened up weeks or maybe even months of really not needing to do anything. We just have to start to learn a little bit more about what that tree is experiencing out there, what pressures there might be on it, and then think about the biology around whatever is creating those pressures, and how do we modify that. There may be instances where the environment just throws everything, including the kitchen sink, at us that year, and it rains for 6 weeks straight, like we've experienced in New Hampshire not too long ago. And maybe the pressures for fungal diseases are just extreme that year, and we have to think about, all right, maybe I need to apply a fungicide to be able to do that. But I would say there's probably a very short list of materials that most home orchardists would need if they are doing all those things that we've talked about to set the tree up for success, and they're monitoring, to see whether those pressures are even out there that season, because it does vary from season to season. And then, you prune regularly to get rid of dead, disease, and damaged stuff. And from there, I think you would be in pretty good shape for success.
All right, so you have overwintered that tree a couple of years. You're in year 2. Depending on how mature that tree was when you planted it, how much growth you put on it, how densely planted together your trees are, you might decide to do another year of vegetative growth at this stage if you don't feel like your tree can handle that fruit. So same protocol as before, just repeat. But Jeremy raised a really good point, is that these key insect pests that you might be seeing, especially the ones that we see in the Northeast, if you want to get really serious about this, you could start monitoring for these pests even before you have fruit on the trees, because you can purchase these traps and monitor for these pests just to see if they're present in your neighborhood. So for codling moth and apple maggot traps, they are both very easy to identify as adults. Here are the adults. I think the wing marcations on the apple maggot is very clear. The wing marcations on the codling moth is a little bit less clear, but once you see that golden tip of that codling moth, you'll feel pretty confident that you know how to identify it. So these two are important to know about because they can result in literal worms in your apple, right? So as tough as you think you are, I don't think that you're going to enjoy that. A dead giveaway that you have codling moth is you'll see some frass at the bottom end. You cut it open and there's either a worm in there or the leavings of a worm. Apple maggot is a little bit smaller. You might miss them. It's less of a big deal, but really bad infestations make the fruit gross. You don't want that. So again, this is a matter of severity. It might not be that big of a deal where you are. All right, so we're in maybe year 3 now. You have nice, robust trees that can handle some fruit. You're ready to get serious. All Rosaceae trees put out clusters of flowers in 5. These flowers all get pollinated by bees, flies, moths, spreading pollen from one tree to another. You will see little fruitlets form after those pollinated blossoms after petal fall, right? So if you were successfully pollinated after petal fall, you'll start seeing these little tiny fruitlets. Commercial growers will apply a hormone to their trees to get the majority of these fruitlets to drop off. They want to reduce the number of fruit that are being matured on each tree. The goal is to have 1 fruit set per cluster instead of 5 little tiny fruits. Jeremy will mention something called the king bloom. This is the first flower that opens in that cluster of 5. So if you think about it, that's all you really need. You can actually go out and trim off the other blossoms as long as you have nice pollinating weather while those king blooms are out. Think pollinating weather, it's the stuff that we like, not too windy, nice and bright and sunny out. This would also be a good time to scout for plum curculio. It's a little beetle, it's adorable. They chew little oviposition scars and little fruitlets right after this, a couple weeks after petal fall. In low populations, they are no problem at all. That oviposition scar, there might be an egg in there, but as the fruit grows, it crushes the egg. You don't see it. You might see a D-shaped scar, but it's just cosmetic. Again, if populations get very high over time, this can be an issue and it can lead to more fruit dropping than you want to. So in the early season, if you don't see a lot of these guys, I wouldn't worry about it. If you live a little further south, there are 2 generations. In New England, there's just 1 generation of plum curculio. In the mid-Atlantic and further south, there's 2. So this can be quite a bit more serious for southern regions, and especially if you're growing soft fruits like peach or plum. Now, your local extension office may offer a resource for this, but you can track all of these pests using degree day models. Also, I'm putting a link to New Hampshire's fruit pest hotline, which is maintained by extension professionals who can give you more of a sense of when to do all these scouting and monitoring activities at your house. After a few years of monitoring for key pests and diseases, you might decide that all these things are non-issues for you. Scab, plum curculio, codling moth, apple maggot may not be an issue at all. None of these are great concern, but I would stay vigilant for fireblight. Back to my conversation with Jeremy.
Fireblight is probably the one that's out there. Folks could think about, like, we haven't talked about copper, but copper is one of those things that a home orchardist could apply as kind of a safety measure to try to either knock down those bacterial populations prior to bloom or protect that new shoot growth kind of post bloom throughout the season. There are safe coppers out there as far as from a plant perspective that aren't gonna damage plant tissue or the finish on the fruit. Not that most home orchardists are gonna worry about that, but that copper is a general biocide, and so it can knock down fireblight populations. And then there are materials out there too that could be utilized to actually try to fend off fireblight during bloom. Once a home orchardist kind of gets into production, and that's where a material like Blossom Protect, which is a yeast-based product, could be a consideration. I'll have to check the label on that to make sure, but I don't believe it's a restricted use material.
I'm gonna do a little bit of homework too, because I know some of the plant elicitors, like some of the biopesticides that are just, we're just starting to see our commercial growers get comfortable with them, and they're kind of seeing situations where it's worth the investment to do it. I don't know if there's a homeowner version of that. My biggest fear is people are going online and buying things that they probably shouldn't be. Just because you can buy it online doesn't mean that you should. Kind of thing. So, but would you agree that maybe somebody who after their first year are seeing fireblight strikes already and it wasn't like an alarmingly bad environmental year for it, then like they should imagine that their neighborhood has a lot of inoculum in it. And they
Yeah,
might be the one who starts thinking about understanding how to use copper, how to use this, that, the other thing. Is that
absolutely. Yes,
a good assessment?
100%. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they can also think about one of the things that makes it easy for Fireblight to kind of expand within an orchard is a whole bunch of lush vegetative growth. And so that's where we want to make sure that we don't kind of like love our plants to death too much, and don't over fertilize, don't over water. If we're getting, you know 8 to 12 inches of new growth each year on an apple tree, like that's sufficient, and that's a nice moderate rate of growth that's not going to be as susceptible to fire blight infections as if we were getting 2 or 3 feet of growth. That's just too much vegetative growth. And so thinking about that as well.
I
um,
think that's helpful for for someone who's like first time out to like set expectations and like
yeah.
slow and steady wins the race. Going forward, how important is pruning and how do you approach pruning if you do see these fire blight strikes like that hook? How do you go about pruning and having that be part of your fire blight approach?
Yep. Yeah. And so that shepherd's crook that you're talking about there, that's going to be it's going to be a visible sign that most likely indicates that fire blight infection has happened. And so that's something that folks are going to need to scout for. They need to be paying attention, and when this is happening is right around bloom time is when infections often occur, and we get the temperatures, we get the bacterial populations, and we get the moisture. But then it takes time for those infections to kind of show any sort of a sign or a symptom that there's trouble. And oftentimes it will be that shepherd's crook. And what you're going to want to do at that point is, if you see it, you'll see kind of brownish tissue or discolored tissue. Sometimes if it's been there a while, it might even turn kind of blackish. And that's where fire blight gets its name, is it kind of looks like it's been burnt. And but that typically, the infection in the vascular system, the internal plumbing of the plant will move downward, typically with gravity, from those growing points backwards. And our main goal as growers is to prevent that infection from reaching the main trunk. So that's our main goal. Oftentimes we have to remember too that there might not be visible symptoms of where that infection has reached just by looking at the shoot. And so what do? We hedge our bets, and we go as far back from that as we have a good option for. And a lot of the recommendations will say like 18 inches behind visible symptoms, so closer to the main trunk from where the infection started, and really be aggressive. What you can do is follow that limb back, or that shoot, or young branch, whatever it is, to a natural junction where another small limb comes off. And that would be a great place to make a cut, especially if it was into, say, 2-year-old or 3-year-old wood. That's typically less susceptible and a little harder for that infection to move through. And so we tend to have better success by cutting into greater than 1-year-old wood. If you have really small trees and that happens, is you can leave a small stub. They call it the ugly stub method. And and so maybe like a 2 or a 3-inch stub. Don't cut it flush with the branch collar like we would normally recommend for a good pruning cut. You want to leave that stub, and that typically kind of has a tendency to arrest the movement of that infection, and oftentimes it will result in it not reaching the main trunk. And then when the dormant season comes back around in the winter, you could go back through and clean that cut up.
In my sense, is that especially here in New Hampshire, where you have a lot of wild hosts living in your neighborhood, you might even have a lot of orchards in your neighborhood. I feel like fire blight is everywhere. Like if you are living in a deciduous kind of environment, it's gonna live there. Like I guess my question for you is, when you see young trees in their first couple of years die, is it because of winter injury? Is it because of fire blight? Like what are your main causes of failure, like in your first couple of years. Am I generalizing too much? Do you think you can answer that?
Well, Fireblight would definitely be one of my main concerns, but I
Yeah.
think if someone knew what we just talked about and they took the precautions there and really managed the blossoms like we would recommend, then I think chances are a lot less likely that they're going to get an infection otherwise, And other ways that can happen are through things like hail damage that, just opens up a wound in the plant tissue and allows that bacteria to get in, or like really strong whipping winds on,
Yeah.
kind of supple, tender shoots. So that could happen that way. But then otherwise, the things we see a lot of that we really need to protect against, one of them is voles with a V. And
Yeah.
so those, basically they look like mice, very similar to mice, with typically shorter tails than mice have, but they love to feed on plant tissue. So a lot of times what we'll see is they'll go through and they'll try to feed on the bark and they'll girdle young trees. And if they've gone around and fed on the bark and a complete ring around the tree, we often get the call like, is there anything I can do to save my tree? The answer is yes, but it involves a technique of grafting called bridge grafting, which can be kind of tricky, and is you need a really good grafter to be able to pull it off successfully. So that basically just bypasses that missing section of bark so that the tree can continue moving water and nutrients around.
So
Um,
it's kind of varsity level stuff. It might be
yeah,
for if you really were passionate about that particular tree, but most cases replanting is what you recommend.
probably so. In that case, yeah,
Yeah.
you're gonna probably lose that tree. The other main issue that we see as far as vertebrate pests is deer, and deer can just be brutal on apple trees because what they'll do is they'll come in and they like to feed on the youngest portion of the shoot, and they'll often just feed on the tips of those branches where it's most tender. And what that basically does is it removes that tip bud, that terminal bud, which, that bud is really important because it produces a chemical called auxin that it really regulates growth backwards behind that bud back towards the main trunk. And so when the deer comes in and snips that off, then basically what it does is it frees up all of those buds that are behind that to start to grow. Where before that they were suppressed by auxin, they all start to grow and produce shoots, vegetative shoots, and that's not necessarily what we want for a tree because it gets really unwieldy and it produces shade and it produces a lot of vegetation that then increases the humidity and the moisture in the canopy of the tree and is more conducive to diseases and some insect pests. It also produces shading, and so that shading is going to kind of prevent that fruit from ripening to its full potential, getting the color that you would hope to see in like a really ripe, beautiful peach or apple. And so we have to definitely protect against deer, and that can be done just through woven wire fencing or hog panels. A lot of folks call them that. You want it to be a good distance out, maybe 3 or 4 feet out from the main trunk, so that the deer can't reach
Okay.
even if they press up against it.
I mean, it's so adorable, but it's such a good point that like just like this one little like one little delicious bite, and all of a sudden your tree architecture is all messed up, and there's all these other things, and
Yeah.
oh, okay. Or I have definitely heard people say, I wanted to do this without spraying, but then I found out that I really couldn't do it without spraying. Do you agree or disagree with that sentiment?
Well, that's a great question. I think um, I think many things are possible, and so the question that I would toss back to someone asking that question is, well, how much are you willing to invest to be able to produce fruit that you didn't spray at all? because there are ways to do it. If we think about you know, just take an apple tree and we think about one of the most common diseases to apples in New England is apple scab, right? And so it's a fungal disease. It gets on the leaves. It winds up on the fruit, and it makes for ugly fruit, early defoliation, weakens the trees over time. But it's just a fungus, right? And there are limiting factors to the development of any organism. And in the case of apple scab, one of those limiting factors is moisture. And so, I know a grower in New Hampshire here who, he's thought about this and thought about the disease triangle. And, we've got a host, we've got a pathogen, and we've got a suitable environment or conditions. And so in that equation, if we take out, leaf wetness, for example, and that's where it usually gets started in the season, is it will come up and spores will be produced from leaves that were infected last year. They'll come up, land on the new green tissue for this season, and if there's enough moisture there for a long enough period of time at the right temperature, then that spore can basically germinate and infect. Well, if we just remove moisture from the equation, we shouldn't have a problem, right? In theory, there are growers doing that and having pretty good success with it, for a number of diseases, depending on how much you want to invest. And that could be time, it could be money, but, it is possible. And growers are looking at doing that commercially, partly to address demand for, low spray fruit. So there's a market there for it, and only so many people doing it.
And by investment, you're talking about building a structure to keep rain off of your trees.
Yeah, a rain fly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that might be expanded to then be well, I've got this structure here. Why not put nets and put those on the sides and drop those to exclude other insect pests, and figuring out the timing associated with that. I think these are things that are really applicable to the home orchard because, if someone's curious enough and determined enough that they want to produce fruit in this way with minimal pesticide usage, then you think about the basic biology and how these organisms function and what they need to thrive, and you start subtracting those things that they need to be able to do that, and you really just tip the scales in your favor, right? And that's so much of what integrated pest management is about, is understanding the biology, what's going on, what are the contributing factors, and how can we shift things so that they're more in favor of what we're trying to grow, and maybe less favorable to some of the pests that we have to deal with out there.
Yeah. I think it's a good point, and it felt like such a radical idea a long time ago to grow trees under cover. But we're starting to see a lot more people do netting and do this and do that and try things. And that might be the New England thing, though. I think that's something that we have a lot of experience with in entomology, where my colleagues in different parts of the country will be like, they're doing that up in New England. I was like, they are doing that up in New England.
Yep. Crazy. And I mean, we have examples here in New Hampshire where we've tried some pilot projects, and there are 3 commercial farms in the state that I know of that have used exclusion netting for this little fly, spotted wing Drosophila, that so much about. And it's very successful. You need a framework to hold up the netting. That can be post and wire systems. In the home blueberry patch, it could be as simple as PVC hoops. A lot of different ways to do that, and it's extremely effective. And some growers say that they had a return on their investment in just a couple 3 years, and so it is something really, really, I think, applicable to home fruit production.
Yeah.
Same thing would be true of individual fruits on a tree. Actually, it's essentially bagging those fruits with a little netted bag. A tiny little moth, like codling moth, that can be so problematic in commercial orchards. They're not that rugged of an insect. They're super fragile. Just placing a bag, a netted bag over that fruit once it's set, we can completely exclude something like codling moth from getting in there. In the home orchard, if you think about it, say we're going to grow dwarf trees in the home orchard. Those trees for apples are only going to get, 8, maybe 10 feet tall. And we really only want them to have maybe, say, 75, maximum, maybe 100 fruit on them. For any family, 100 fruit is going to go a long way. So we might be able to go with even less than that, grow several varieties, and those fruits down to just the best fruits, what we call the king fruit. That biggest blossom right in the center of that bloom that the apples put out. And the other 4 of those blossoms, ideally, we would just pick those off or pick the little fruitlets off and just allow that biggest, best one to develop. And then as that does, once pollination has happened, essentially we can start to protect that fruit in any way that we're going to do that. And by putting a netted bag over that and allowing it to develop, you've really eliminated the most impactful insect problems that you're going to encounter through the season. So it could be as
Yeah.
simple as that.
And they sell wedding favor bags online. A question I have for you about this idea of rejuvenating orchards. Every time I've ever heard somebody say like, "Oh, we have this old orchard, we want to rejuvenate it," part of me wants to be like, "What's wrong with the way it is?" Right? Like your point about, like 100 apples, that's pretty good for, like sometimes some of these old gnarly trees that put off apples, maybe the apples don't look super pretty, but they're fine. Like that seems pretty good, and I can definitely see why somebody would want to be like, "Oh, how do we go about making this better?" What's your feeling on that? Like, do you have any advice for rejuvenation? Like, is it worth it? Have you seen people be successful?
It's a really interesting question, and just the whole idea around like what is happening in those orchards where, you know, you drive by and surprisingly in, July, they're not completely defoliated. They have leaves on them, and the foliar diseases that we would expect to see aren't, as severe as we would expect to see. So it does, beg the question of what's happening there. Is there just a balance that's been found, that, the good guys and the bad guys are kind of, in a reasonable balance together. I think the thing that I think about in a situation like that, and a lot of it has to do with just the site that you're growing, the surroundings, they're around that. And by surroundings, I mean, is it forested around it? Is it an urban area with a bunch of houses and not a bunch of trees? Because that may make a difference in the pest complexes that are hanging around there in the orchard, right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of it also I think has to do with the variety of tree that's being grown out there and how resistant or susceptible it is, or to a certain disease, or how attractive it is to a certain insect pest in particular, and that's something that there's research going on kind of looking into that now. Out of UMass, Dr. Jaime Pinheiro has been leading this study for a number of years now, looking at how can we basically utilize the preferences of insects like plum curculio, apple maggot, and try to kind of manipulate their behavior based on their variety preferences. And so the way that Dr. Pinheiro's looked at doing it, and this has been in conjunction with growers who have just observed this over the years, that say, hey, this variety of apple, say it's Wixon, this cider variety, is just always hammered by apple maggot. They just flock to it. It's the first place it always shows up. They just prefer apple maggot. And so, there are varieties that for one reason or another, maybe it's the odors that they produce, or the color of the apple, whatever it may be, that they're drawn to that. And so I think that is also at play in some of these abandoned orchards, as far as what pests are we dealing with, how severe are they, in addition to what is going on surrounding the orchard.
And some of the things that you mentioned before about, you don't need all five flowers to be producing fruit. Like that's something you could do to manage your fruit load. You could use the bag thing. You could do all these things on those
Yeah.
trees without having to completely rejuvenate the whole thing. I'm not really sure what people mean when they say rejuvenate, but I think they have something in mind that might not be necessary.
What I will add to that though is like when I sometimes I go into abandoned orchards and see things like bittersweet, this invasive vine growing up and over the canopies of the trees in the orchard, and that sort of thing really is something that I think would fall under that tag of rejuvenation, is like just getting that underbrush out, getting the restrictions that are happening in the tree, opening up that canopy through pruning, and then doing really good sanitation underneath the tree, and those fallen leaves that could have one disease or another on them, rake them out, blow them out in the fall, shred them with a mulching mower, chop them up, and boy, that can go, I mean, just such a long way to minimizing your problems. And that's the cool thing about backyard orchards, is that we can do some of this stuff at the scale that we're going to do it at home to a much further extent than a commercial grower growing, hundreds or thousands of acres of apples could implement. And so we really have some tools in our toolbox that commercial grower might not have. And so that's where I think we have to think outside the box about what we can actually pull off to produce the quality of fruit that we're looking for, or that is acceptable to us, that's usable to us, versus having the perfect fruit. Because really, I mean, who cares if it has a spot on it or an insect took a bite out of it? It probably just means it tastes good, As long as it's still good, sound fruit, let's eat it.
That's a really good point.